Hello everyone. Oh my goodness. We're trying a very different setup here. I moved my bookshelf, my beloved tiny bookshelf. I feel like I'm in the hot seat of like an interrogation room with this type of lighting. I have not been very well. My voice is still recovering, so I'm gonna sound a little bit disgusting throughout this video, sorry. So yeah, I recently released my November TBR video halfway through the month, but I wanted to do like another reading style vlog, even though I'm here now having read 6 or 7 books in November already, because I did not record as I read them. I said it in my spooky vlog, I just struggle to sit down and record my thoughts halfway through a book. It's the 23rd of November, so I still have a good week or so left to be reading. So the first book that I read and finished in November is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. Last week my review will have gone up. Obviously I finished the last chapters during the first few days of November, so it doesn't really count as reading it, but I did technically finish it in November, so I feel like it's worth giving a mention. It's so dark. There we go. All my thoughts will be in the Rebecca review. From here on, from my November TBR video, how I chose the books is different from how I'd usually do it. So, you know, I'd use the picker wheel to choose what books to read next, and then I would hide the books that I wasn't reading in that month and then use the picker wheel again. However, I was kind of like getting a little bit bored of the picker wheel, so how I did it is I just looked at a stack of my books, labeled them 1 to 5, and then did a random number generator, and whatever number happened, I would have to read first. Unfortunately, this method actually did nothing for me because I gave the 120 Days of Sodom number 1, and number 1 was pulled last. So I still ended up reading them in the order that I probably would have chosen without the randomized element to it, but you can't say I didn't try. So the second book in November I ended up reading was The Midnight Timetable by Bora Chung, translated by Unton Her. This is the one that I was super excited to read. I talked a bit about what this book is in my November TBR video, but what I find that Bora Chung always does so successfully in her books is balance humor and horror. The format of this is really interesting because although we have one overarching protagonist, this protagonist is being told stories by different members at the research facility that she works at that is haunted. And these other characters go into such depth about their stories, you essentially feel like each protagonist is really whoever's telling the story, even though at the end of each short story it will circle back around to our unnamed protagonist kind of reacting and asking questions about it. So it's nice because I feel like some short stories can feel quite disconnected from each other, or it's really hard to like care about each short story in the same amount if there's different settings, but because most of these revolve around the same research facility or around characters based at the same research facility with some callbacks to previous characters or haunted objects, for example, it all links together very well and feels really cohesive and full as a short story collection. One thing I'd say about Bora Chung is that her language always feels very simplistic, not necessarily a negative thing either. This sometimes makes you wonder if the translator kind of makes a few sacrifices in order to translate her writing for readability, but also this is only the second Bora Chung book that I've read, so there's a chance that this is just her writing style. And having seen her speak in person, I think she is very thorough and very precise with her words, so I do think this is more of a writing style choice rather than a translation choice. But it's interesting, it always feels like very calming, weirdly enough, to be reading her short stories, even if they're horrifying. There's just like a certain simplicity that always makes it feel comfortable, familiar. This comfortable, familiar writing style is probably what helps her build up this kind of balance of humor and horror. So I gave this 4 stars and I finished this the 3rd of November, and I'm excited to read my other Bora Chung book that I got in the same time. I think she's so cool. Hang on, where is Red Sword? Oh. Yeah, when I rearranged my bookshelf, I also put my TBR up here, so that's those 2 stacks on my TBR. Next up, I read The Flight of the Falcon by Daphne du Maurier, the most disgusting book that I own. Disgusting in appearance, not content. I have way more disgusting books than this. I said it was my 3rd du Maurier book in my notes. This is absolutely not my 3rd. This is my 5th Daphne du Maurier. I think it's fair to say that I am a big fan of du Maurier now. Probably would consider her one of my favourite authors. I'd say I enjoyed The Flight of the Falcon almost as much as the other books as well. I feel that one of the elements of Daphne du Maurier's writing is that she really takes her time submerging you, really like engrossing you into her stories, her characters, her settings, and I never find that fatiguing. Like, it's always enjoyable to read. I'd say that The Flight of the Falcon has a bit of like a deceiving slow start. It feels much slower, but when you look at the plot overview, I was sat there thinking, I know this is going to kick up. I know something good is going to happen. So this beginning probably isn't going to be as slow as I feel it is. Once our main character, Armino, reaches the fictional Italian town that Daphne du Maurier created, it's called Ruffano or Ruffano. I'm gonna say Rafano. It doesn't exist, so it's hard to say how it's supposed to be pronounced, but once he reaches Rafano, the story definitely picks up and you kind of get more into the rhythm and the feeling and understanding what the story is supposed to be and where it wants to take you. I think it was great exploration of the haunting of your youth and also nature versus nurture. And this is all set amongst like a very rich Italian background. Some beautiful setting writing here in my opinion. There's a lot of interdepartmental university politics within this book that's definitely part of the humor and arguably part of, like, I'm gonna say horror, but it's not typical horror. It's more kind of the horror of seeing something unfold before your eyes where you're like, oh my god, this is uncontrollable, and how do you stop someone from doing something that's just like utterly crazy? That kind of horror. There's a lot of humor in the university politics and the discussion of this too, because we're from an adult perspective. The main character basically takes a temp job as a university librarian, so we get to witness a lot of the ongoing politics at the university. It was really enjoyable as a reader too to watch the sibling rivalry develop, particularly when you kind of see the past. We're gonna go, I suppose, a little bit into spoilers here, but it was also great to see the sibling rivalry. Like, it was really enjoyable to read because you've got our main character believing his brother is dead and reminiscing on like kind of how awful his older brother was to him when they were kids, and you're sat there at first thinking, is this just like regular sibling hatred or rivalry where you're two young boys and one of them is a bit mean to you? But then you read further on and you're like, oh no, this is strange. This is incredibly competitive. It's very fueled and charged, and it's not typical upbringing, I'd say. But then to discover that his brother is actually alive. So this rivalry is like consistent throughout the entire novel, despite our main character thinking that his brother is dead for probably the first quarter of the book. The only thing I'd say about this book is that I think it did go on for a little bit too long. But at the same time, watching the final third of the book play out, as has been somewhat prophesized, was so fun. I couldn't even be mad at the length of the book. I'm not going to say any more on that point. The book just goes so full circle. It's very satisfying. There is one character in here called Carla, who I think her character was supposed to be too on the nose, but it still felt too on the nose for me. Mild spoiler talk again. There is an alleged rape of a character and other kind of quite intense violence that we're supposed to believe actually took place as the reader, and Carla just finds this funny. Like, she finds it funny. She laughs, and when the main character tries to show some kind of confusion or shock that she's finding it funny, she doesn't seem to find it weird. And this made me question, just how satirical was Stephanie du Maurier being in creating this character? Like, was this intentional? I really could not tell, but it made me uncomfortable. I don't know where I sit with Carla's character. It'd be interesting to read more around what other people thought about that. The Flight of the Falcon overall I gave 4 stars. It's certainly not my favorite du Maurier book, and I probably wouldn't reread it for a while just because of how dense and drawn out it is at times, but definitely keeping. Will be on my bookshelf. Maybe I'll buy a nicer copy for myself at some point. And I finished this one November 6th. Oh, my voice is struggling, guys. The next thing I read in November was Out There Screaming. This is the black horror anthology that I've had my eye on for a long time. Now, I'm gonna say that it's always hard to rate an anthology accurately or fairly, particularly when it comprises so many different authors with so many different writing styles, subgenres in particular. Like, horror is such a wide-ranging genre, so to try and curate an anthology that feels consistent and satisfying as a reader is so difficult. Unfortunately, I don't think Jordan Peele did the best job. That's not to say there aren't some amazing short stories in here, but as a full anthology, it is a bit disappointing. So I had like 3 or 4 standout stories in this anthology for me, and those were Wandering Devil by Cadwell Turnbull, the other one by Violet Allen, Pressure by Ezra Clayton Daniels, and Flicker by L.D. Lewis. I think in particular the first maybe 5 or 6 were quite difficult to get into and didn't get off to the best start. Despite some of the stories in here being great, sadly I feel like as an overall anthology, quite a few of these stories didn't fit well or weren't very well suited to the shorter formats. A lot of these stories had me very confused, feeling very dissatisfied because I didn't feel like they had the space to expand, or that they left me with like so many more questions or wanting more from the story. Like, I want more because I don't understand what happened. It felt as though some of these stories were cut short, or that they weren't allowed to flourish, or that the author perhaps had a bigger idea not originally for a short story. story and then had to kind of restrain themselves and cut out parts of the story in order to fit within this format. That was very much the vibe that I was getting. I'm always going to say that I appreciate horror anthologies existing, particularly black horror, having the space and the time made for them in a genre where they're often overlooked or less published. I'm never going to complain about something like that. And there are also some amazing concepts within these stories, even if I didn't really appreciate the overarching format. I think there are some great ideas within here. I definitely plan to check out some of the author's other works, especially ones that I enjoyed. Overall, I gave Out There Screaming 3 stars, and I finished this November 10th. Next up is Time Shelter by Georgi Gospodinov, and you will realise I am not holding my copy of the book. It's because I didn't finish the book. DNF alert, I gave it away to a friend because I tried on multiple different occasions to read Time Shelter in different settings, different mindsets, and I just could not get into it. And this is the second Gospodinov novel that I've tried. Whilst I did get through the first one, I didn't enjoy it, and it just wasn't my vibe, my writing style, the type of stories that I like to read. When it came to Time Shelter, I really wanted to keep an open mind and think just because I've read one book by an author before doesn't mean I'm necessarily guaranteed to hate it, but I was not enjoying it. I think the concept was incredibly cool, but it was not really executed in the way that I found engaging. I read about 45 pages. With other novels that I DNF'd, I've probably given more time to try and read it or read more pages, but I just knew deep down that I was going to be forcing myself, and I didn't feel like it. I mean, there is a point within the first 40 pages where I had to Google who the protagonist was of the story because I find Gospodinov's writing very inaccessible. I find it confusing, it's abstract and surreal on purpose, but to me it doesn't click. And I know I could have given the book a bit more time to really kind of figure out myself who the protagonist was and who was we're actually following. But at the same time, I knew that if I didn't find out at that point, I would be left confused and therefore further disengaged when reading it. So I Googled it and then I was like, oh, okay. And even after knowing who the protagonist was, I wasn't enjoying the story or where it was going. DNF, I'm not going to rate this one. I don't think it's fair to rate. I couldn't engage with it enough to really give it a rating, but I officially DNF'd on the 13th of November for Time Shelter. Next up, I want to talk about my experience going on to NetGalley. So I've started requesting and reading some arcs. This is a very new experience for me. I wanted to give it a try, so I read Madness of the Elder Vampire by Darby Vernon. I was drawn to this because of vampires. I like vampires. It's as simple as that. So overall, I'm going to say that this was a decent read that I very much went into with an open mind, with the knowledge that it's an arc, and also that it was a bit out of my comfort zone in terms of the genre. Just because I like vampires doesn't mean that I'm going to love every vampire fiction that comes out. I just knew going in that I probably wouldn't pick this up necessarily, but I specifically wanted to go out and test myself. What I liked about this book was its characterization and its dialogue. I think it was very well placed. It never outstayed its welcome, and I think the dialogue could have probably been used a bit more to help world build and character build as well, particularly at the very beginning. I think the beginning gets off to a bit of a rocky start, mainly because we've got a lot of exposition dumping outside of this very natural dialogue. Unfortunately, upon beginning the story, I feel like there was a lot of awkward world building done through a past flashback, and sometimes it's a bit awkwardly done. It feels like it's interrupting some very natural dialogue, some very natural character building, just to kind of get the character somewhat up to speed with what's going on and how this universe's vampires operate, how they work, because there is a bit of a different approach taken, which is also one of the things I enjoyed. Is essentially you have these elder vampires who cannot feed on humans anymore and must feed on other vampires. So you have kind of this further social hierarchy constructed within vampire hierarchy, where not only do you have elder vampires, but you also have the feeder vampires for the elder vampires. So that was interesting because I felt there was a cool parallel to be making there between vampires and humans being their prey. However, then the feeder vampires, or vassals as they're called in this novel, are then kind of put into the prey's perspective by being the elder vampire's prey. I don't think that was really leveraged enough. I feel like that's quite a cool thing that could have been discussed or explored a bit more throughout the story, but no, I don't feel like it was ever fully brought forwards or thought about too much, which is a bit of a shame, but I still think the concept is cool. I would say also that the exposition dumping that happens a bit at the beginning does improve as you get further through the book, most likely because you're getting more familiar with the characters, the lore, the world, the further on you get, so it feels less dumpy. I think the humor was also great in this book. It's a pretty slow burn, particularly in the romance area. So if you're going to go into Madness of the Elder Vampire expecting straightforward romance, this is not what you're going to get. I'm going to say arguably I don't really think this is a hugely romantic book, and because of the slow burn nature, it was nice to laugh really unexpectedly at these like random quips or asides. And through this humor and also just other elements of the natural dialogue and characterization, I think the author also just makes it easier for you to sympathize with the characters, or even if you don't sympathize with them, if for example they're characters that you're supposed to hate, it at least makes them enjoyable reading. There was never a moment where I was like, I don't care about this character, I don't care about reading from their perspective. I didn't feel any of that, so that was pretty good. In terms of other cons, however, I felt like the pacing was just out of sorts. So the chapters are told from nights, so like night 1 to 8 or something. We are getting multiple perspectives, switching from the same nights. However, like some perspectives have gone through to night 8, and then we go back to a different perspective of night 6. And it's just things like that really affected the pacing and also just my immersion as a reader. And I understand completely what the author was aiming for, but there was probably a better way to be presenting it, because there are times where I ended up feeling really impatient, kind of like finishing someone's perspective or someone's story whilst I was still waiting to get answers for like a previous night from a different character's perspective. I found myself more frustrated with that approach than finding it mysterious or gripping. So I'm gonna say that this book had like some great ideas, really natural dialogue, but could probably have been improved with further editing to kind of fix these pacing or continuity issues. And I gave Madness of the Elder Vampire 2.5 stars, and I finished this on the 17th of November, but I'd been reading it quite consistently throughout the month because I was finding it difficult to read digitally. I was picking up and reading physical books during all the times that I was trying to read Madness of the Elder Vampire, so I found it a little difficult. Now I want to talk about another arc that I read, which is called Plastic Prism Void by Violet Allen. And if Violet Allen sounds like a familiar name, it's because I literally just said it. In the Out There Screaming Black Horror Anthology, there was a short story from Violet Allen in there. So funny, I read this entire arc and then googled the author afterwards and was like, hang on, she was the author of one of the short stories that I really like. It is crazy. It is fun, it is confusing, and it is definitely not going to be for everyone, but for the people that it is for, they're gonna love it. This would be my first try at what I'd call like a genre form-bending novel. Some people say it's similar to House of Leaves. I've never read House of Leaves, but I've seen how it plays out on page and it looks confusing. I feel like this book is quite similar to that because it plays around so consistently with form, characterization, setting, and I just ended up finding it like exciting and disorientating at the same time. The comparison that I feel like I can make, having read it, is This Is How You Lose the Time War, except if the book didn't follow typical formatting on the pages and had transgender main characters, and also if the book was on crack. This is what Plastic Prism Void is like. For me, I felt like the disorientation added so much to the story, especially nowadays, to just not immediately understand everything that I'm reading. When it comes to the characters, what exactly is going on, or what universe we're in, or the rules of how this universe operates. Like, we're just trusted as the reader to just keep on reading, to stick with it, and really give it a go. And I found it quite refreshing, particularly after my previous fail this month, reading something a bit more different through Time Shelter. Our main character is so compelling, so witty, very clever, and very cutting in her narration. And I think like this is what keeps you going throughout this book. Even if you're confused by like the non-linear storytelling, you want to stick around anyway to kind of hear all of her asides, all of her footnotes, all of her endless like cultural, social references. More than once I found myself like grinning, laughing out loud at like not only our main character and how witty she is, but also how the actual form of the book just plays with your expectations of what a book should look like and what should happen in a story. If you go ahead and read it, you'll see what I mean by like the representation of her cousins, for example, or any other like time, space, bending elements of the story. I absolutely cannot wait for this one to get a physical release, to see how this actually plays out on the pages of a book, how it's executed, because reading it digitally, even reading it digitally was so exciting, so I can only imagine what it's going to be like as a physical copy. And I think definitely worth a second read once you've kind of got your bearings a little bit. Again, similar to This Is How You Lose the Time War, you go in and you're like, the fuck is going on? And then by the end you're like, I kind of get it, and I kind of don't, and that's kind of the joy of it. I'd super recommend it if you love sci-fi as well. This is an incredibly sci-fi mecha boy, butterfly queen story, or also if you're looking to get out of your reading reading comfort zone, so I gave Plastic Prison Void 4.5 stars. I finished this within a day, I think within a 24-hour period on the 18th of November. I'm now going to talk about a book club book. So I'm part of Hannah Witton's Patreon, and within that there is a book club. I think this is my third time doing it, and I always love the books that we end up choosing. There's a lot of feminist critiques and sex positive books that we read, and it is The Once and Future Sex, Going Medieval on Women's Roles in Society by Eleanor Janega. I had been reading this one pretty steadily throughout November. We do it chapter by chapter, and then towards the end I just kind of rinsed through it. I wanted to be over and done with it and to take my notes. I was hesitant to actually buy this one. This is a library book because the previous two books that we read I had bought, but for this one I wasn't sure if this was like something I actually wanted to own or reread. I'm not a huge history buff. It's gonna sound so silly, but this was much more historical than I expected. I know it's literally like a medieval to modern times perspective on feminism, but it felt quite academic in nature, and I guess I wasn't expecting it to feel that academic. At times I just felt like this was incredibly dry, and I didn't really care much for like the specific topics that she went into, even if I liked the overarching topic itself. And the further we got in, I felt like the more repetitive it ended up being. There was a lot of philosophy, medieval philosophy, which at times definitely felt applicable, but sometimes I just kind of felt a bit tired. I'm gonna say mainly that the presentation was really quite dry, and that took my enjoyment out of it. There were certain chapters that I definitely found much more engaging, much more interesting to my personal interests. The main two chapters that I really enjoyed were the ones kind of looking at medieval beauty standards and how men perceived women, and that was really interesting. And then the other one was looking at sex and relationships in medieval times. So those two were much more interesting to me than, for example, the chapter on labour and work and the final chapter bringing everything together. At that point, I think things started to feel a bit repetitive. This is one of those books that explores feminism that just makes you so mad when you're reading it, because you're like, how did anyone think this? And how do people still think this? But I think the author also gives quite a lot of grace to medieval thought in terms of modern approaches of always thinking that like medieval feminism, so to speak, was so backwards and that we've progressed so far as a society, and actually we should probably give more grace to things that women were able to do back then, and to stop thinking that like every past time period was so completely backwards and that we're so much better in every way, shape or form, because really there's a lot that hasn't changed. We just have different perspectives to put upon it and more advanced technology to help push beauty standards, for example. So I say if you're into like historical non-fiction, this is probably going to be much more interesting for you than it was for me, but it was an enjoyable book club read nonetheless. And I gave this 3.5 stars, and I finished this on the 22nd. I'm going to talk about the book that I'm currently reading, and it's rough. The 120 Days of Sodom by the Marquis de Sade. So as I've mentioned, I've been really sick over the past week, so that probably hasn't helped my approach and my attitude towards this book. So I definitely slowed down on the reading front. I knew going into this book that this would be difficult. It would not be an easy ride, it would be disturbing, and it would be disgusting. What I did not expect is that I would literally become nauseous from reading this book. Because oh my god, what the fuck? I'm only 38 pages in too. I've really not made much of a dent, and I'm still in the introduction. So there's an introduction to the actual main story, which goes into excruciating detail about the four main characters, the four libertines who are doing the debauchery, the sadist, horrific acts. So much detail. By detail, I mean their appearances, their hygiene levels, their length, their colours. It is horrible. It's so horrible. And also just like pretty dull. Pretty much the introduction is just introducing you to the main characters, all of the people that they're going to be doing the acts upon, some pretty in-depth backstories of each of the four main characters too. I don't know what I'm going to have to update when I actually get into the main story if I'm so disgusted. So far, I feel like I have a pretty good stomach for disgusting things. I'm still struggling. And thank God for the end notes, because what's quite funny actually is that this is set in like a specific castle in Switzerland, but for one of the four main characters, when they're going into the backstory to explain how they grew up, the kind of depraved acts that they always ended up doing, so on and so forth, for one of the main characters, it's missing. Like Sade left a note basically to say, put this stuff in, and then he never had time to do it. And thank God there's an end note which was like, presumably Sade did not have time to do this, basically, because part of that character's backstory links to where the castle is in Switzerland and why that castle was chosen. Such an important backdrop to the setting of the overall story is missing. If the endnotes didn't say, oh, by the way, this character's name is probably in reference to the missing story that we've heard previously, how would I have known that? I wouldn't have known what the fuck was going on. It's whatever. Every page is just so full. So much asshole. I'm going to definitely get to the end of the introduction. I'm going to try and get to like part of the main fucking story. I'll see how I get through part 1. So I don't know if this will be a DNF. See you later. Bye-bye. So it's a few days later. I've DNF'd the 120 Days of Sodom. I got 100 pages in. So I've tried this book out of curiosity, but I knew deep down that I would struggle with this book, especially after the first storyteller. The story is told in technically 5 parts. We've got like the introduction, and then we've got the novel split into 4 other separate parts. I got through the introduction and through some of part 1. I got through the first 2 days because it's 120 days. By the end of the second day, I was just like, no, this isn't gonna work. I cannot do this. As I mentioned previously, the introduction introduces the 4 libertines and all of the essentially prisoners that they have, with a few kind of co-conspirators like their wives, for example. And then part 1 goes into the actual events. And how this works is that each day they have a story time and a different storyteller come in and talk about all of these like depraved acts that they've done previously. And these acts can then be interrupted by the 4 libertines' urges. And on the first day, when the first storyteller was telling her story, I couldn't do it. For those of you who've read the 120 days, you'll know why I couldn't do it. There's no enjoyment to be had from this book, and there's definitely an argument to be made where you don't have to enjoy a book for it to be valuable, to hold literary value. But for me, I knew very early on, after reading the first story, that I would not gain much from this. So the introduction, written by a different person, introducing the book, not the introduction as part of the book, was more valuable, more interesting and insightful to me than any of the content of the actual book. And how this story came to exist and be published, and the fight for it to be published was much more interesting. Like, the criticisms of this becoming part of the literary canon was so interesting. But then you read the actual book and it's like, oh man. In the previous segment, when I said that I tried to get through part 1, I was clueless that part 1 is essentially the whole book, and that parts 2 to 4 are very much still parts of the manuscript that were in note form, incredibly short, scattered. Part 2 lists the acts that were going to happen each day rather than expanding upon anything else. It's very much in a list form. Part 2, 3, 4 is for the other 3 libertines, but those are all in note form because Sade didn't finish the manuscript. He wrote this in a little under 120 days when he was imprisoned, and then hid the manuscript in the prison wall. I don't think Sade expected it to be published, and it very much has retained its manuscript form. And that's why in the previous segment I was saying, like, there's a whole person's backstory that just doesn't exist. I didn't read the introduction to the story in huge depth because I'm always worried about spoilers, and typically I go back after I finished a book. But this time around, I probably should have just read the introduction to better understand what I was getting myself into. The text is boring, it's very repetitive, it's just too nasty for me to feel like I can fully engage with it and get from it what other people can whenever they get through this book. I understand part of the book is to become desensitized to how horrific it is, and that within itself becomes a commentary on violence and accepting violence. I was literally getting nauseous reading this book. I was also getting bored. I don't know how you can get bored and nauseous simultaneously, but here we are. That's what I was doing. Hard DNF. Probably going to get rid of this book as well. I don't think I really want it on my bookshelf. So after DNFing the 120 days, I promptly wanted to find another read that would pick me up a bit. I was like, listen, I want something short or sweet, or something that I really want to read that's not going to take too much from me. So I turned to Grandmaster of Demonic Cultivation. I've talked briefly before, I think, about MXTX, her works, particularly MDZS, and this is the Manhua adaptation of the novels. It's a special interest for me. I've got matching bunny tattoos of the main characters from the story, and I make them kiss. So I knew that going into volume 9 would make me feel much better. It did, it very much did. The only thing is I go through these so quickly, I just cannot help myself. I will finish them in like 20 minutes. I don't want to talk too in depth about this one. It's volume 9 of a long running series, but I've read the novels, I've watched the TV show, the manhwa is still being adapted. And what is really interesting to see is that there is kind of like, there's a lot of flashbacks, a lot of time differences. And so you have like 15-year-old versions of your characters, and then you have like modern day 30-year-old versions of your characters. because the artist does a really good job distinguishing between these two timelines. But what I found interesting is how the entire art style kind of feels significantly more mature when you are in the timeline where they're 30 years old. So here we have some of our characters at 15 years old. Obviously there's a mixture of like chibi in here as well, which isn't the best representation. Here we go, like they're gonna look super young when they do chibi art style. And then we have them at 30 years old here. I prefer the overall style. My main criticism of these volumes will always be that splitting it up to be this short rather than like blending two volumes together, for example, will always be quite confusing. I know this story quite well from having watched the TV show, reading the books, and being a fan of them. But there are times where I'm still getting confused, thinking, are we in a flashback? Are we in a dream? There's a lot of switching between the 15-year-olds and the 30-year-olds versions of these characters. So it's confusing to come back into a volume that's just been published that splits these timelines. Like honestly, my knowledge from the novels is coming in clutch here when reading these manhwa volumes. Unfortunately, I don't think that this artist is amazing at action scenes. This series revolves a lot around drama, politics, relationships. However, there are a lot of heavy-handed action scenes, a lot of flying around, there's a lot of demon cultivation stuff. I don't feel like the way that the artist draws action scenes translates very well on the page. I'm often finding myself confused who's doing what exactly is going on, particularly when there's a lot of low-lit scenes or scenes happening at nighttime in the dark. So it's just such a shame because there's so much action in this series that I feel like we miss out on and we don't fully understand. I don't know if this is a personal preference thing. I think the art is beautiful, but it's confusing. I tried to get into this story actually years back before the story was physically published. I think even before the TV show. And I tried to read the online version of the manhwa. And I was so confused what was happening that I dropped it. And it's so funny coming back now to this being like one of my favorite series, and the only way I understood it was through the TV show and the books combined, because it's quite complex. And sometimes I just feel like a few extra pages or scene transitions would make things go along a little bit easier as a reader, particularly as a first-time reader. I mean, I still gave this 4.5 stars, so clearly didn't hugely impact my enjoyment of the story. Definitely what I needed after Sade. And I finished this November 23rd. Since we're straying way off the TBR at this point, I was like, I'm not going to spin the picker wheel, I'm going to pick up another book that I really feel like reading. So I picked up Hunchback by Sal Ichikawa, but it's so tiny and I've heard so many good things about it that I was like, this is what I want to be reading. Oh my goodness. I read this in one sitting. I mean, it is a novella, it's only 97 pages long. Formatting is very clean, neat, easy to get into. I'm going to say that this is a pretty easy read, not in terms of content, but more in terms of the pacing and being dropped right into the main character's world. And it starts off so witty and so zany and just like enjoyable, very explicit, that by the end when I finished it I was so surprised by how it had developed, how far we'd come from the opening chapter. There's not really chapters in this book, it's kind of one flow that's broken up with a few asterisks sometimes or a changing of scene. For a novella, this is so well crafted, really well paced, very satisfying. I didn't feel like it was rushed or underdeveloped or like I was left wanting more. And I loved how it made me feel kind of equal parts sad and also amused. Like this witty humor comes through really well when talking about something that is quite debilitating for our main character. She is super compelling as a main character, mainly I think because she is able to acknowledge her position. Ichikawa has created a very self-aware perspective of a disabled main character who has a huge amount of wealth. So naturally there's this quite clear perspective on intersectionality when discussing this disability and wealth. And we get this through Shaka's thoughts herself, but also through kind of the final chapter and where we end up going, which is somewhat of a divisive choice for a lot of people. And the end did completely throw me for a loop. I understand why it's divisive. I understand why some people did not like it and felt incredibly confused by it. I was also very confused. I finished the book and was just like, what? Huh? Then I went and reread the last chapter. Then I went and read all the reviews that I could find. Then I googled the ending to read everyone else's interpretations because the reviews just weren't cutting it for me. The reviews weren't talking enough about the ending. It was one of those. I think the ending threw me off so completely because the book is very comfortable. It's so small. You end up falling completely into it. You're in Shaka's universe. You're buying into like mostly everything that she's saying. That last portion came at me so fast because I didn't really realize that I was potentially reading reading from a different perspective. We're going to go into spoilers here. There's obviously a lot of discussion of if the last chapter or so is like you're into one of Shaka's stories again, where perhaps she's using the sex worker as like a self-insert character, or if we're supposed to believe that Shaka had actually been murdered and that we're from a completely different perspective of someone related to the murderer. The second is much more horrifying and upsetting. I personally am more of a fan of the first perspective, that we're thrown into a story by Shaka, and this would be kind of similarly mirroring how we start the book, where we're in one of Shaka's stories without realizing that's what we're in. I think that would be quite a cyclical, satisfying ending. Less depressing, but I personally love it when authors can like so easily suck you in to a story and then spit you out straight away. That's how immersive this book was for me. I gave this 4 stars out of 5, and I finished this November 24th, so very quick. Next up, honestly, I think this is how I will be finishing off November. I went again to my TBR pile and just chose what I really felt like I wanted to read, maybe something that I had been meaning to get to for years. Yellowface by Rebecca F. Kuang. I started this last night. I get it. She's so easy to fall into. Like, her writing style is so... This is my first R.F. Kuang book. Been meaning to read Yellowface for years. I'm so excited to get further into this. I absolutely hate the main character, which I love. I love hating the main character for justifiable reasons. What a great concept. So I'll update you when I finish this. Alongside that, I'm also listening to the audiobook of Let It Snow, the 3-part story by John Green, Lauren Miracle, and Maureen Johnson. This is part of my rereading challenge and something kind of fresh and lighthearted. My main comments so far, I'll save most of them for my rereading challenge book video, but the first story, I'm not a fan of Jubilee as a main character. It very much is one of those like early mid 2000s, not like other girls narrator vibes, but the story itself, not too bad. So we have less than a week until December, 5 days left, but I am now very much of the approach after such a horrible book, 120 days. I'm just gonna take it easy for the rest of November. I'll catch up with you at the end of November now. Hello, I'm here back with the mic and with the new phone, so a very clear camera that is freaking me out a little bit, how high definition I am. I'm gonna wrap up November. It is December 2nd, and this is what I read. So where we left off was Yellowface. Yellowface was an interesting one because I've been meaning to read R.F. Kuang for a while now. I totally understand the hype with Yellowface, and I think for the first half of the book I was fully sold until I got to the second half and kind of fell out with it a little bit. So I'll go in with my main issues first, and that was the pacing and the way that Kuang doesn't seem to trust her readers to make conclusions themselves. In the final third of the book, I feel like a lot of the text could have been cut. It wasn't really telling us anything that we didn't already know, or we couldn't have already figured out from the clues that we've been told before, or what Juniper has already told us as the main character. Like when she goes back to visit her mum, teaches some writing classes, there's nothing there that is necessarily needed to progress the story. Usually I wouldn't mind this, but I felt it drag, and that's when it becomes a bit of an issue. Because as a reader, that section felt a little aimless, but all it does is re-establish the relationship that we already knew she had with her mother, and show that she is not above abusing her power and her position to bring people down for her own gratification. The second issue is the bigger issue I had, and that is the heavy-handedness of Kuang's writing. I just don't think that she trusted her readers to be critical enough, and like I said, to draw their own conclusions and read between the lines rather than what felt like spoon feeding us. It kind of worked at times because we do have like a very biased narrator who is the kind of person I feel like who would over-explain things in order to justify her actions, but by the end of the book it was really grating to me. We didn't have enough space as readers to breathe and to make our own judgments. And I think this links back to the pacing issue because June's bigotry ended up feeling repetitive because the book was so long. And I think honestly the book could have been cut by around 50 to 100 pages and it still would have been just as impactful and delivered its message successfully. I'm always a huge fan of unlikable narrators, unreliable narrators, so I think that's where I enjoyed this book the most. A well-written book with a well-written, unlikable narrator is enjoyable, so that was the strongest part of this book, I think, and the concept was just way too juicy to not find entertaining. It's like horrifying to see all of the terrible things that June does, and also so satisfying to then see her break down, get what is coming to her. I think another thing is that Kwang doesn't really analyze deeply enough, for my tastes, the intersection between race and wealth. Like, this is a thing that is brought up, but it's brought up by June against Athena, and it's not really explored further than mentioning that Athena had a lot of wealth to pursue a writing career, and that gave her a leg up in the writing career. But I don't feel Kwang examines that, and it's also told through the eyes of a very racist, bigoted character, so it kind of devalues the necessary criticism of leveraging wealth and analysing how marginalised authors in one way who have privilege and wealth succeed or fail to succeed in the publishing industry. That would have been very interesting to explore, but I guess it wasn't that type of book. There's obviously more recently, in the past few days, the whole thing coming out about R.F. Kwang was headlining a literary festival in Dubai and then has since pulled out, but people have found her response not satisfying enough considering the complicity that Dubai has in the current state of Sudan. So it's all a bit messy, and it's been really interesting to see people discuss that right as I finished reading Yellowface. Kind of bizarre how all of that lined up. Otherwise, this is just genuinely an enjoyable read, and I do plan to check out more of R.F. Kwang's books across the different genres that she writes. And I gave Yellowface 3.5 stars, and I finished this November 28th. The final book that I read in November, I'm gonna skim over because it is due its own video, and that is Let It Snow. Oh my god, it snuck in there. I finished it November 30th. This was not good. This was not a good book. This was not an enjoyable book. I did not find it entertaining. I would have absolutely DNF'd it had I not done it as part of a reading challenge. I gave Let It Snow 1 star. And I will explain why in a future video. Let's go through some of November stats. So in November I read 11 books. I'm technically going to count that as 10 because I don't feel that counting Rebecca as one of my November reads is fair, considering I read maybe around 30 to 50 pages of it to finish it off. So let's say 10 books, and that is 3,309 pages. Interesting, my most read genre was romance with 4 books. What counted as romance? Rebecca is a romance? I guess. Then fantasy, horror, literary. These stats don't surprise me. The romance does, but I don't know if that is just a miscategorization. So yeah, that's what I read in November. Here you go, that's November. Plus an audiobook and some ebooks. It was kind of heavy. I'm impressed with myself. I hope you enjoyed watching. This might be my last video of the year. Who knows? We'll see if I hustle. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.